Good morning. This is Kenneth with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to do a quick rundown and recap of the legislative session this year. And we have today Josh Downham who is the Minneapolis Public Schools lobbyist. How are you doing today, Josh?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me, Kenneth.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I think this is such an important moment and opportunity, so I really appreciate you having us here or joining us today. To help us understand what went down and what was kind of a confusing end to session. But first, why don't you, for folks who aren't familiar with us or with you, tell us about yourself.
Well, thanks. So I am the lobbyist for Minneapolis Public Schools, and I'm very fortunate to be in this role. I'm a product of MPS, and in fact, my youngest daughter is graduating from Minneapolis schools in a couple of weeks. So it's really in my blood. And my grandfather led the marching band, with the big hat and all that, many years ago at Washburn High School. So it's really it's something that is really important to me, that we have a very strong public education system here in Minneapolis. And, I feel fortunate every day I get to wake up and lobby for the kids and families and staff of MPS. It's really been an honor.
That's awesome. I appreciate that. So tell me, what does lobbying look like? What does that term mean? I think we all have heard of lobbyists, but what does that term mean in terms of you lobby for MPS?
So, really the board and the superintendent decide on a list of priorities that they would like to see the state legislature and Congress move forward. And some of those are policies, some of those are funding items. And so we get a legislative agenda that's passed by the board. And then my job is to take that agenda, turn it into legislation. So working with staff at the Capitol, and then get those bills drafted, and then get authors, lawmakers who are willing to put their name on that bill, and then try to get a hearing on it, line up testimony, move it through the process. And as you know, it's a challenging process. It's designed to be very challenging. So not every idea actually comes to fruition.
Sure.
Very much by design. But underlying all of that work are relationships. Because as a lobbyist, you really have one thing, and it's your word. And if you're going to work with a lawmaker, regardless of what party they're in, you have to have credibility. And so making sure that all your data is accurate, that what you say to one person, you say to the other. You never want to try to, zig or zag in that way. You really have to be straightforward. And you've got competing interests and parties. And as you know, Minnesota is only one of two states with a divided legislature. Senate is controlled by Republicans and House controlled by Democrats. Makes it very challenging because those two caucuses decide which bills actually get heard.
Yeah.
So it's a rambling answer to what a lobbyist is, but it's relationships that hopefully advance some of those critical pieces of legislation, and then building coalitions of other groups. Association of Metropolitan School Districts, or any of the statewide organizations, the Education Minnesota, we all have to, we overlay in many ways.
Yeah.
And you've heard me say this before, Kenneth, but it really is a Venn diagram, and all the groups overlay. So like Minneapolis and St. Paul, we overlay pretty closely. Other groups, it's less so, but I'm always looking for what we can do together to try to advance policies or funding items for kids.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. And thanks for that explanation. I think it's important to just understand, because I think we hear so many nefarious things about lobbyists, and it's just such a loaded term. So I appreciate you for breaking it down for what it is and what that means for Minneapolis Public Schools. And so you mentioned that, the board and the superintendent set out a set of legislative priorities. Can you go over what MPS's legislative priorities were for this year, or at least like some of the main priorities?
Sure. So before I jump into that, if you wouldn't mind, I'll give just a quick background on what a biennial budget process looks like at the Capitol.
Sure.
Is that
Yeah.
okay? So Minnesota's, I think, somewhat unique. I know Superintendent Graff has appreciated the fact that the state passes a 2-year budget. In Alaska, it's an annual budget, so you don't know what you're getting until kind of the last minute. In Minnesota, they have a budget setting session, which in our case was 2021. And they passed a 2-year budget that provided funding for the current school year and next school year. And that budget had a series of line items, funding items, which was things like the general education formula was a 2.5% increase for the current year and a 2% increase for next year. Well, we all know what's happened to inflation since they passed that budget. It's gone through the roof. So costs for schools have gone up commensurate with inflation. Plus, with the new teachers and paraprofessional contracts, costs have gone up as well there. So there's cost pressures on districts, and the funding that was provided during that 2-year budget in 2021 really didn't meet the needs of schools. So coming into the 2022 session, which is they called a non-budget session, it's usually focused on capital bonding projects for like state universities, roads, bridges, waterworks programs, those kind of things. Well, this year, given that inflationary pressure on schools and the fact that we had an historic budget surplus. I mean, I've been around the Capitol for 32 years, and I've never seen anything close to a $9.3 billion budget surplus.
Wow.
So there really was an opportunity this last session to do some real reform or investments. And so the district looked at that, and really the top 2 priorities for the district were to have the state start to make some progress on closing the special education funding gap. So the underfunding of special education for MPS is about a $52 million hole. Every year we pay out, or it costs us $52 million more than we get in state and federal aid for special education services, which means that comes from the general education fund to backfill. We have a similar underfunding in English learner services. And in both of those instances, statewide, those gaps between funding and resources are actually increasing. So English learner services, for example, had a huge jump from about 104 million to 146 million statewide in the underfunding of English learner services. So taken together for MPS, English learner and special ed, it's almost $70 million a year.
Wow.
So those on the funding side, those were the 2 priorities that our board said, go fix that. The good news is groups like the Minnesota School Boards Association, Schools for Equity, Minnesota Rural Education Association, Association of Metropolitan School Districts, and then a number of advocacy organizations all coalesced around special ed. And we made huge progress in the House bill that came out. I know we'll get into, I think, some of the numbers at some point, but
Yeah.
really we had an opportunity to make some real progress on the underfunding of special education, which really is a huge need for MPS, but for districts across the state.
So just to recap, we have a 2-year biennium, and in that 2-year biennium, we usually in the first year of that biennium, which was 2021, that is when we usually make a lot of our investments in programs like education, like education. Since we did that last year, usually we don't do that in the second year of the biennium, but this year, since we had such big issues of underfunding for school districts, and because we had so much money in our surplus, there seemed to be an opportunity to do so. Is that a good
Yes, and
Recap of it.
and it really, it comes down to what do those state budget forecasts look like. In this
Yep.
case, we had this historic amount, um, but there's also the cost pressure side of it, like special
Yes.
education, like inflation, and it really, you had these two interests or two issues kind of hitting schools. And as you well know, schools are struggling to find employees to
Yep.
fill really important jobs.
Yep.
And so that's putting cost pressure on our wages. So bus drivers, school nutrition staff, paraprofessionals, we need to offer more in terms of wages to attract those people.
Right.
So it's an important part of what we do. You can't deliver the service without humans. I think we're at about what 80% of our budget are salaries and benefits. We're a people-driven institution, and so when you see cost pressures on that side, and every district is seeing them now, you really need the resources to just continue to deliver the services that you deliver.
Right. And so that, and then you look at, we have $70 million of services that we have to provide that is unfunded by the state. And then you look at Minneapolis Public Schools budget, and we have a $27 million gap this year that we have to cut in order to balance the budget. Yeah, it makes it really difficult to operate a district in that way.
Well, I think our actual, our structural deficit is about 59 million. So we were able to use both ARP funds and some of the budget reserve to bring it down to that 27 million.
Yeah.
But the structural deficit is $59 million. So
Yep.
you think about the underfunding of English learner services and special ed. That would go, if you fully funded those two, it would close our structural deficit.
Wow. So there's an opportunity to at least do that for this year. So tell us about what then ended up happening. Like what was the journey through session, and how did we end up with what it sounds like the news is reporting? Essentially, nothing happened come May 23rd. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the governor came out of the blocks with a very ambitious supplemental budget recommendation that he provided the legislature. So in the K-12 area, he proposed about $786 million of new funding for this next next school year. So in the legislative parlance, that's fiscal year 23. And the way the legislature has to do it, they have to balance their books for the current biennium, which is fiscal year 22 and 23. So that's the biennium we're currently in. But there's a requirement that they actually balance the books for the next biennium. So so now not only are we looking at the next fiscal year, we're looking at fiscal 24 and fiscal 25.
So just to pause. So they have to, just to like break this down a little bit simpler, they have to plan to balance the budget for school year 22, 23, and then school year 23, 24.
And the one beyond it. So there's
and school year 24, 25.
So there's 3 years. So if you think about it from like your budget for you and your family.
Yeah.
And you look at your salary, you look at your expenses, and then you're trying to decide if you want to buy a new car, and what are the payments for that new car. But instead of a fixed rate, the rate on the loan is variable, and it goes up.
Yeah.
So you have to think, well, my salary next year isn't going to go up by 5%. It's going to go up by 2%. But that loan's going to go up by 5%.
Right.
So I have to account for that. I'll have to cut back somewhere else in my budget.
Right.
So the legislature is always looking in this case, they're looking 3 years down the road. Last year, they had to balance 4 years.
Yeah.
So that's really important because
so this year the legislature had a plan through school year 24, 25.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so when they do their budgeting, they say, okay, here's a budget target for education for this coming school year. And then here's a budget target for the next biennium. And they then look at their revenues and say, do we have enough money to cover both of those figures?
Yeah.
And the good news is not only did the state have 9.3 billion for the next year, but like over 6 billion ongoing, so that they actually had the resources in those future years to cover some ongoing expenses.
Sure.
The worst thing you want to do in education is say, hey, we're going to give you $200 million for 1 year.
Yeah.
Well, then you go and hire a bunch of staff and then you have to lay them off.
Right.
So you really want, if you're going to put money into K-12, make sure that it's ongoing and so that you can plan and budget for that.
Yeah.
So the governor, and I'm just going to look at my figures here. The governor had a recommendation for next school year of 786 million. And then for that, the following 2 years, 1.4 billion.
For the full state.
For the full state.
Yep.
The House went above and beyond the governor, and the House Democrats put 1.3 billion into next school year, and then 2.2 billion into the following 2 years.
Wow. Okay.
So it was a substantial increase in funding for schools.
Wow.
And that contrasts with what the Senate brought to the table, which was 30 million for next year, and then 1.4 million for the out biennium. So if you think about it, it's 1.3 billion, 30 million.
Right.
And so the Senate focused exclusively on professional development training for teachers around something called LETRS, which is a literacy training, particularly for K-5 teachers.
Yep.
But eventually for all teachers. And then the House had a myriad of proposals, including addressing the underfunding of special education. So we would have gone, getting a little in the weeds here, but there's a piece of the special education formula called the Special Education Cross Subsidy Reduction Aid. And so in our case, that's that $52 million. And right now, under current law, the state backfills or provides districts with 6.4% of that 52 million.
Okay.
And the House would have brought that number up to about 56%. So from 6% to 56%, a substantial increase to really start addressing that underfunding. That was one of, by far, it was the largest component of the House's proposal.
Yeah.
So those three sets of priorities then come into a conference committee of House members, Senate members, and the governor. And the majority leader in the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and Governor Walz came together and they said, okay, we're going to set a budget framework for a deal. That we've got we got the historic budget surplus. We're going to do a deal and we're going to put $4 billion into new spending. We're going to put $4 billion into tax relief. And then we're going to leave $4 billion on the bottom line. And the way they get to 12 billion includes the current budget reserve that's already there. We already have a budget reserve kind of over there. So they would have added, I think, about $1 billion to that.
Sure.
So within the $4 billion of new spending, $1 billion was dedicated to K-12 education.
Okay.
And that billion was spread over those 3 years that they have to plan for.
Okay.
So in the first year, the committee had $320 million to spend. And then the last 2 years of that piece would have been $680 million that they could dedicate those ongoing funds. So the House was in a position of having 1.3 billion and having to pare down their bill to 3 billion. And the Senate was,
okay.
And the thanks for catching that.
Yeah.
1.3 billion down to 320 million.
Yeah.
and the Senate was at 30 million, and they
Yeah.
had to come up to 320 million. So it's just, you can really see the challenge in a conference committee of trying to blend together two disparate, set of priorities.
Yeah.
And then you have this number that kind of comes in the middle. Well, all of the things that made it into the House bill have constituencies behind them. They all want their thing. They want free school meals. They want compensatory revenue for low income kids. They want special ed, EL funding, all of those things. Whereas the Senate, they just had one item in their bill. It was just the letters training for teachers. And so they just said, okay, we'll do our bill and we'll put the rest of it into special education. And then they said no to all the other provisions in the House bill. And it really set up a real challenging dynamic this year, simply because we had that two-year budget that was set last year. There's no consequence in terms of, there's no state government shutdown. Schools will continue to get the money that they were promised last year. Government will continue on even if nothing gets done this session. There's no backstop for there being real consequences to walking away from the session. And that makes it challenging, because if you really want to do something, then you're in a position of having to compromise more.
Well, wouldn't the consequence naturally be like the way that the system's supposed to work, right? Wouldn't the consequences actually be like elections? Like, why wouldn't maybe some of the Senate Republicans be like, you know what? We need to fund our schools that are underfunded, because the underfunding of special education doesn't just impact Minneapolis, right? The underfunding of schools doesn't just impact Minneapolis and St. Paul, and it impacts the entire city. So wouldn't the natural consequence of not doing anything, like people not doing their jobs, essentially be maybe you don't get elected?
Yeah, I think ultimately that's how you hold an elected official accountable.
So why would the strategy be to not spend it then?
Well, I think there's the two. So one of the other deals that they made when the governor, majority leader, and the speaker set out that broad framework of a deal is they said that all of the bills have to pass as one set of bills. You can't just pick and choose one.
Sure.
So when conferees actually got to an agreement on the tax bill, which would have had billions of dollars of tax relief for folks, they had to hit pause on that bill and wait for the education bill, the human service bill, transportation bill, all those funding bills to get resolved, and then all of them would pass as a package. And getting to the election part of your question is, I think there are so many different competing interests among all of those bills. Like each group, like, hey, group homes and workers in long-term care need a raise. That was a big issue. Eliminating the tax on Social Security income was a big issue for Senate Republicans. Ultimately got included in that tax bill, but everything hit pause when they couldn't come to an agreement on some of those spending bills like education.
Yeah.
So I think when you go back to voters and say, we held out for these specific issues, and this was our rationale for saying no to an agreement. Both sides are going to have their say in that, right? They're going to bring both of their viewpoints to voters, and ultimately voters are going to decide how that aligns with their own thinking. So I think this is pretty, I would say, no different than any normal year where you have two parties really battling it out. I think the challenge this year is that every time you're in a first term of a presidential term, that midterm election, you usually see a pendulum swing from the president's party to the other party. And certainly in polling that I've seen, Republicans are just in a generic ballot are polling stronger than Democrats. And I think that's one of the pieces that you're going to see play out as folks try to decide, okay, do we make a deal? Do we not make a deal? Do we save the money until next year and have that be part of the 2023 budget? So there's a lot of dynamics that are happening. All 201 legislative seats are up for election this fall. We had redistricting, so they're running in different seats. I mean, the boundaries are all configured differently.
Yeah.
And for the first time, I believe this is true, for the first time since 2002, you have all the statewide candidates like governor, secretary of state, and so on, attorney general. They're all running at the same time all the 201 legislators are running. And so there's going to be a lot of energy around this next campaign. Even for a non-presidential campaign, it's a very consequential election.
Yeah.
And I think particularly if you have, 8 to 9 billion on the bottom line to use and how that 2023 legislature looks, you're going to probably have a third to half of the legislators are going to be brand new.
Yeah.
We've already had 39 retirements announced and 19 members running for other seats out of 201. And we haven't even had the primaries or the general yet. We're going to see probably close to 50% new lawmakers. And that's going to be a real challenge as we try to educate them about issues like special education underfunding and those kind of things.
Yeah.
And in our case, Minneapolis, we have an issue, and maybe we can do another video on this another time, Kenneth, but
yeah,
a little piece called special education tuition billing, which when a resident of Minneapolis enrolls in a neighboring district or a charter school, the funding for that student follows to that new school. So all the state and federal aid goes to that new school. But if they provide special education services at that school, the unfunded part of that gets billed back to the resident school district. It's called special education tuition billing. And the last numbers I saw from 2019, it was about $22 million of costs that come back to Minneapolis that we pay because they're residents of Minneapolis. However, we don't get any resources. We don't get our local levy. We don't get state funding or federal aid, and we simply have to pay the bill. So, trying to get the legislature to wrap their arms around that, it's really kind of been built up over time based on this historic notion that a pupil is a resident of a district, while the state has layered new different ways of school choice on top.
Yeah.
And they've never reconciled those two things. And for some districts like Minneapolis, tuition billing has a real impact on our budget.
Sure. So I appreciate you for, coming on and sharing all of this. And so where do we sit then? So we just are essentially going to wait until next year for this money to be resolved? Or I know there's been a little bit of a talk of special session. Can you quickly talk
Sure.
about like special session and what does that mean and what would that do?
Sure. So the governor is the only one has the authority to call a special session. Lawmakers can't do that on their own. However, once the governor calls a special session, it's actually the lawmakers themselves have the authority to determine which bills are taken up and how long they stay in session. So it really requires a lot of negotiation among all the parties. So the governor and then the leaders of the four caucuses, House and Senate Democrats, House and Senate Republicans. So you have kind of five-way negotiations when it comes to getting agreement around a special session.
Yeah.
And once the legislature adjourns sine die, which they did this last Monday, they have to start from scratch if they're going to reintroduce bills. It's not like the bills carry over into a special session. So they have to introduce the bill.
Well, sorry, before we go totally into that, why did they adjourn on Monday? Like, if their work wasn't done, why did they just decide like, okay, well, we're done with session?
So it's a constitutional deadline. So that based on the state constitution, they had they could pass legislation up till midnight on the 22nd.
Okay.
And then on the 23rd it's more of a pro forma day. They do speeches and, people said goodbye basically. So, but yeah, the state constitution lays out those deadlines.
Okay, so then that's why you have to create a special session then if you don't meet that constitutional deadline. Okay, so you were saying that for a special session, they have to reintroduce bills. They have to go through kind of the process again, hypothetically, even though, a lot of talking has happened over the course of sessions,
Right.
so maybe it can happen a little faster.
Well, and that's where the five-way agreement's really important because there are certain timelines that bills have to meet. To the process is actually a number of days it would require, where a bill has to sit on the desk so that folks can digest it and that kind of thing. Well, you can suspend the rules and move that legislation through more quickly. But to suspend the rules, you need both caucuses, both House Republicans and House Democrats to suspend the rules for the House to move that bill through first reading, second reading, third reading, and then to final passage. You could do that if both sides agree to do that. If the minority party says, nope, we're not going to agree to that, then you have to go through this long waiting process and then the full set of amendments. So then you could have 50 or 100 amendments on a bill. That bill then gets passed and sent to the Senate, and the Senate's like, no, that's not what we agreed to. So it having this five-way agreement is really important so that everyone knows the terms of what's going to be done, but it really empowers the minority party in a way that they don't have in a regular session. So Senate Democrats have a little more power in a special, and House Republicans have a little more power. And they can make it a lot more challenging to actually get something done in a special. That said, I know the leaders are planning to meet after Memorial Weekend to try to see if they can come to an agreement to hold a special session.
So there is some willingness from the five leaders.
Yeah, I think it varies.
Yeah,
I know Speaker Hortman has said that she absolutely wants to have a special session, as has the governor. And I think I'm assuming that the Senate Democrats also want to hold one. I believe they do. And Jeremy Miller has said he's open to it. He's the majority leader of the Senate.
okay.
But I think the Senate or the House Republicans are probably the group that's least interested in taking what was close to being passed this last year and moving it forward. So Kurt Daudt is the minority leader in the Senate or in the House, and he now has a stronger hand to play in these special session negotiations. And I think what he has said is he'd like to see less spending than what was in the original deal. So lots of pressures, lots of things to be negotiated. But I think to your earlier question about politics and the campaign, they're all right now trying to weigh that. They're trying to figure out what's going to be best for not only, from a policy and funding standpoint, but looking at the campaign, what are their voters saying? And so a lot of those calculations are being done right now. And my hope is that people do say, you left your work undone. You have this historic opportunity with the budget surplus, and we have these cost pressures on schools that are hitting right now. We need to address that. So if folks are so inclined, I really encourage them to call their local lawmakers and say, get back to the bargaining table,
Yeah.
and hopefully we can get a deal. I'm not. I think to be a lobbyist, Kenneth, you have to be like the glass half full person,
Yeah.
because if you're half empty, I think you quit pretty soon.
Sure. So my last question for you then is, what would be the best outcome for Minneapolis students? Like what needs to happen for the best out? So you said people, basically you already said, right? Like people should call their legislators to have a special session. So it sounds like a special session is necessary. We should pass some thing out of education. But yeah, can you explain like what's the best deal here for kids? What's left on the table? What are you talking to legislators about?
So I think that really it's going to come down to those caucus leaders making a determination whether they're going to be all in or not. In Minneapolis, our entire legislative delegation is Democrats. So our Senate Democrats, like Patricia Torres Rey and Scott Dibble and those folks, they're in the minority party in the Senate, and they have very little say in a typical year. But they now have a little stronger hand in a in a special session, so they can say through their minority leader, Senator Franzen, they can say, please ensure that $320 million that was agreed to as part of the budget deal for K-12 is preserved. And so, as I said, Representative Daudt has said he'd like to see some of the spending get to shrink some of that. I think it's important that we let our lawmakers know that no, with those cost pressures on schools across the state, with these large gaps in funding for special ed and English learner services, $320 million is an absolute minimum to actually make a dent in some of these big issues. So
Yeah.
ensuring that our House members, our state senators know where we stand as a community, and $320 million for K-12 statewide is where we would like to see the special session end. We have only so much clout because we're one city out of the entire state, but I think it's important that they know that K-12 education finance or funding should be at top of mind for our entire delegation.
Yeah.
Perfect. And I do want to put a plug in, Kenneth. I appreciate you actually having me on here.
Yeah.
One of the things that's been really kind of my unexpected joy of my job is working directly with parents. And so one of the parents of an MPS student approached me and said, hey, other districts have legislative action committees. So these are groups of parents who are part of a group, and in our case, we put out action alerts to parents. We keep them informed of what's happening at the state legislature. And so we now have close to 300 parents who have signed up, and it's really taken off this year. So if folks are interested, I'd encourage you to get in touch with me, or you can go to the district website, and under government relations on the MPS website, there's a little 3-question form to fill out with your name and your email. And then I will push out those updates during the session and action alerts on occasion. And, as your kids age out of MPS, I'm happy to take you off the list. But really, it's about keeping the community engaged. I know everyone's busy, so I try to keep it to a minimum, but really trying to help families and parents really understand what's happening at the Capitol, how that affects our own budget and MPS, and then ultimately what's happening to the budgets of their schools. And it's a direct line.
Yeah. Well, I know that I appreciate being part of the Legislative Action Committee and getting those alerts. So, thank you for all the work that you do. This session was and continues to be frustrating and captivating and critical, right? With all this, all this money, all of this need, elections coming down the pipeline, how that impacts all of it. So thank you for being up at the Capitol and utilizing your relationships, utilizing your information and knowledge to drive home priorities for Minneapolis Public Schools. So we really
Well,
appreciate it.
I appreciate that, Kenneth. And, I want to work with everyone who wants to advance the needs, of Minneapolis kids, families, and staff. And so I appreciate your advocacy. I appreciate the work that in my partnerships with MFT and others. It really is going to take all of us working together on these shared areas. And it really isn't, I know folks sometimes, especially with social media, you grab your phone and you fire off something. And I just ask folks to take it down a notch and let's figure out how to work together and keep personalities out of it. We all want what's best for kids. We have different ideas perhaps on exactly how to get there. But if we just write off groups or others, I think we do a disservice to actually the whole district. So I really ask folks to just take a step back. Don't send the tweet. Don't call someone's motives into question. Know that they want the best for MPS students, but they may have a different idea. Let's sit down and have a cup of coffee and actually talk through it. That's what I implore all my friends, regardless of where they're coming to this discussion. I don't know, maybe that's too old school. I see my kids, like saying things online that I would never say in my entire life, but I maybe that's just being the age I am, but I really do think if we're going to solve these broader issues as a society, I mean, gun violence is really, I'm sorry, I'm going to get a little teary, but it's something we have to address, but we can't walk away and just vilify people. Let's figure out how to pass those red flag laws. Let's do the background checks. Those are things that we can do. And so, sorry, I veered off in a different territory, but it's
No,
Robb Elementary has me just, reeling. So,
I mean, as it should. I mean, all of us should be, all of us, and yet it's also far too common. And so we all have our process on how to process at this point, but we can't normalize it, even though it is far too normal in our community and our society. So, Josh, I appreciate you for being on for this long. Thank you so much. You're a wealth of knowledge, and let's see something great happen to end this school year and with hopefully a productive special session.
well, great. I appreciate the time, Kenneth.
Awesome. Thank you.